Drug manufacturing across North America has been on the decline for decades, but for many, it took a global pandemic to understand the implications. Just how great is our dependence on other countries for essential medicines and pharmaceutical ingredients, and what initiatives are underway to mitigate supply chain disruptions? Dr. Frank Gupton is chair of the Department of Chemical and Life Science Engineering at Virginia Commonwealth University. He is also the CEO of Medicines for All and the co-founder of Flow Corporation, where researchers are focused on the security of medicine supply chains right around the world. Dr. Gupton, thanks so much for taking some time for us.
Thank you for having me.
It's quite remarkable that this chapter actually begins at retirement after 30 plus years in both the pharmaceutical and chemicals industries. So let's rewind to 2017, your vision for a healthier world and the Medicines for All Institute at VCU. How did this all begin?
Well, I guess it all began early in my career when I was working in the commodity chemicals business, because I'm got kind of an unusual background relative to a lot of people that worked in the pharmaceutical industry, and that most of those individuals spent their careers in the pharmaceutical sector, whereas I started out in commodity chemicals, where margins were very tight and pennies made a difference, and that got ingrained into me very early on about how we can improve processes and make them more cost effective. As I transitioned in my career from chemical industry to the pharmaceutical industry, we seem to have lost track in some ways about the cost of manufacturing, and that it wasn't one of those essential elements for success in the pharmaceutical industry. And it was more about time to market than anything else, and being able to capture as much of that patent life of a drug as possible. So with that mindset, there was a lot less emphasis on the cost of the active pharmaceutical ingredient. And because they only represented a small percentage of the selling price of an innovator drug, somewhere in the order of maybe 5 to 10% of the overall cost of goods in the marketplace for the drug was associated with the API, or at least the selling price of the drug. So there wasn't a whole lot of incentive to come up with a really world-class process that focused on not only efficient chemistry, but also more efficient manufacturing platforms that also resulted in a significant amount of waste reduction in the processes. And that's basically what we've been focusing on since I've been here at VCU, and looking at different ways of producing material much more efficiently than they've been produced in the past.
And you refer to that interface of chemistry and engineering and the opportunity to reinvent or repurpose technology to optimize the drug manufacturing process. So how do you manufacture medicines in a cleaner, greener, more cost-effective way? And shouldn't every drug manufacturer be doing this?
Well, I think they all try to. I think we paint a picture of the pharmaceutical company somewhat bleak and dark sometimes, but they're really, their mission and their goals are really noble in trying to develop new technologies to treat disease states. But I think that one of the things that I look at is something that you touched on earlier, and that's that this requires kind of a multidisciplinary approach to solving the problem. So it's not just the chemistry, and it's not just the manufacturing platform, and it's not just the waste that's being generated in the processes. It's all of it. It's an end-to-end solution. And the thing that we're most interested in looking at when we start off is the chemistry, and looking at processes to see whether we can actually make a huge impact on the way the molecules are assembled. And when you look at pharma processes typically generate very large amounts of waste. So when you start thinking about a pharma process, you're looking at typically generating 100 to 200 kilograms of waste per kilogram of product. And so there's a reason for that, and that is that solvents that are used in the process end up getting consumed at different points in of the process. So say you have a complicated molecule that you're making, and there are 5 chemical transformations that have to occur in that process. Well, if you have suboptimal steps in each one of those processes where there are lower yields, that means you're generating a lot of byproducts, which means you're going to have to isolate those intermediates and purge those impurities out of the system before you can go on to the next step. Now, if you contrast that with a process where you have really good chemistry and you get a 90% plus conversion in the reaction, why do you need to separate and isolate those intermediates? Because that's where all the waste is being generated in the solvents that you're losing in the process. Some people might say, well, you could recycle the solvent, but the problem you have is when you have these impurities that are intermixed in the solvent, companies are reluctant to recycle that solvent for fear of building up those impurities in the process over time, which would end up entering the system and entering the product that would cause the material to either be off specification or maybe create some materials that are more unwanted in the product. So what we look at doing is trying to take the process and say, what's the best chemistry that we can develop? Okay, now if we can develop each individual step to have 90+% conversion from the reactants to the product, then we not only eliminate a lot of waste, but we eliminate a lot of manufacturing costs, because we don't have to do the crystallizations, we don't have to do the centrifugations, and we don't have to do the drying operations, and we can just pass it on to the next step. So then the next question is, can we use common solvents so that we don't have to switch solvents in the process? So we go from starting material A to intermediate B to intermediate C to product D without isolating any intermediates or changing solvents. That's how you're able to do these things. And it's not rocket science, it's common sense. And it's just a question of finding that chemistry and putting those constraints on the students up front to say, look, you can't use multiple solvents. You can't isolate intermediates. And then once they do that, it almost results in a default situation where they end up with a process that is much more efficient. And then when you can do that, then you open up the opportunity to be able to run these reactions in a much more efficient manufacturing platform, like continuous processes versus batch. And I started out my career working on continuous processing in the commodity chemicals business. This is not new technology. The commodity chemicals business has been making their products for years continuously because they couldn't afford to produce them any other way. So this is all very doable, a very doable approach to addressing these issues.
Well, and this continuous process is critically important, because when COVID hit, it really immediately exposed the vulnerabilities that exist. So just how great is the dependency on other countries for important medicines and active pharmaceutical ingredients? And what are the inherent risks that come along with that?
Well, the challenge that we were faced with was that when people were using batch manufacturing platforms, they were inherently more labor intensive than continuous processes. Continuous processes are highly automated, so you have a whole lot less labor costs associated with it. But it requires technology. I think one of the things that kind of surprised me or shocked me a little bit was when you look at our gross domestic product. I think the pharmaceutical industry represents 5 to 10% of the whole GDP. But it's the only sector in the economy, a major sector in that economy, that's not using assembly line mindsets to produce the product. And part of it is because of the regulatory constraints that are put upon them, and also the fact that they can afford to. And so the other challenge you have with drugs that are currently produced using batch manufacturing is the volumes are lower, and the life cycle of the drugs are a lot shorter. So it's not like you're making a commodity chemical like acetic acid that's been produced for 100 years at pretty much the same flat rate. These pharma processes will fluctuate, so having these batch methodologies allows them to manage their capacity in ways that that you couldn't do with a dedicated continuous system. But that being said, there are ways to deal with that, because if you're looking at why we ended up in the situation we did with regards to all the offshoring and manufacturing, it's because of labor primarily. And so higher labor costs tend to put India and China at a distinct advantage over the United States. So companies just said, well, let's just offshore those activities and have some kind of cost benefit from doing that. But the problem is it's about risk and reward, because you're putting those products at risk, and nobody really, or people tended to minimize that until COVID hit. And then when COVID hit, this whole issue about supply chain became a big issue. And then I think people don't think about it too much, but that I guess even more recently, when the Suez Canal got blocked, that was another example of what could happen in an acute case rather than what we saw with COVID. And it also adversely affected our supply chain. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities for us to think differently about this situation now that we've seen kind of the vulnerabilities associated with the decisions that have been made in the past.
Well, you were very uniquely positioned to respond to that ever-growing need for pharmaceuticals as the pandemic unfolded. How did the mission and the mandate of Flow Corporation help facilitate the very quick production of medicines in high demand to treat COVID?
Well, I think, if you start looking at what we did at Medicines for All, and I guess that's probably where I'll focus my comments on with regards to that, is that we were already doing this work with the Gates Foundation. I mean, we had this mindset in place because we wanted to make the goal of our work with HIV drugs, TB drugs, and malaria drugs was all about reducing the cost of the API, or the active pharmaceutical ingredient, in order to be able to increase the amount of drug that we could purchase with the same amount of money, so that would then expand the access to the people that needed the drugs the most. And so you basically take that same strategy and apply it to this internal need that was created as a result of COVID.
So, what has all this meant to the production and delivery of vital medicines here at home and on a global scale? Does a strong domestic supply translate to not only a good stockpile, but also lower drug costs for many medicines?
Well, it's our hope that this will translate to the consumer. And all I can tell you is, we're in the beginning phase of that with the onshoring activities. But what I can tell you is the work that we've done with the Gates Foundation. They invested over basically a 5-year period, something just under $40 million. Okay, and we built some world-class laboratories here to work in this space, where chemists and chemical engineers work side by side to address these issues. But the Gates Foundation is projecting that their annual savings with regards to their ability to purchase more drug is something on the order of between $60 and $80 million a year off of that $40 million investment. So to me, this is demonstrated that we have a lot of really low-hanging fruit, but equally important, it's serving as a platform to train these scientists and engineers of the 21st century about how to address these problems in a different way than they've been addressed in the past. And I really feel strongly that, a lot of academic institutions probably aren't set up to do this. And I just happen to be in the right place at the right time, because I'm an organic chemist, but my process, when I was in industry, my process research groups were a 50-50 mix of chemists and chemical engineers. And so I was very comfortable in that space. And my research group reflects that. I have PhD students and postdocs that are chemists and chemical engineers that actually get cross-trained by working close side by side with one another. And I think that adds value to their educational experience, in addition to solving some of these fundamental problems with regards to access to healthcare.
Well, Flow is working with a growing number of partners to produce high quality and low cost pharmaceuticals domestically. As a public benefits corporation, a company that adopts a social responsibility mission, what comes next? Do we see that 80% need for APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients coming from other countries? Do we see that reducing at some point in the near future?
I see it maybe a little differently. And here's what I see. I'm looking at um, the issue of job creation. And when you start looking at the opportunity that's presented, it's not just about the active ingredients, it's about the whole supply chain. You know, if you, whether you're in Africa or in the United States, if you look at making the formulated product or the active ingredient, and you still have to buy the starting materials from China, then you're still vulnerable. So the solution has to be a more holistic solution where you're looking at the whole supply chain and how you can take very simple building blocks and convert them into these advanced organic molecules that are of high cost. And that, again, goes back to our work with the Gates Foundation. And that's one of the things that we did. One of the levers that we had to control our cost was by, instead of, it's kind of a counterintuitive approach to the way pharmaceutical manufacturing occurs today, is typically what they do is they'll buy the most highly functionalized, expensive starting material possible that would allow them to produce the drug in a minimal number of steps, okay? What we do is we do just the opposite, and we go back to very, very simple building blocks. And then by being able to run these reactions in a very highly efficient way with high yielding steps, we telescope them into a minimal number of unit operations so that we can produce the drugs cost effectively from very inexpensive starting materials that we can access more effectively than people have in the past.
And as you say, all the while educating the next generation of chemists and engineers. Dr. Gupton, we thank you so much for taking some time with us today.
Well, I certainly do appreciate the opportunity to share with you the work that we're doing. And, you know, I just have to say that, you know, I never expected to be doing this at this stage of my life, but, you know, what really is what keeps me coming back every day is the students. They really are pretty amazing, and they keep me young. So they teach me something every day. Sometimes it's stuff I don't want to know, but other times, most of the time, it's right on target. So listen, thanks again for having me.
We wish you the very best with all of your many endeavors.
Thank you. Take care.